most of each other, but my name is Steve Holt. I'm executive director of the Lake Pond Oreille Waterkeeper. We have Carolyn Knaack, who's our associate director and was instrumental in sort of putting this presentation together, as well as Henderson, who's the president of our board and who's been intimately involved with the monitoring program for quite some time now, maybe 5 or so years. Gray?
I actually, my first time on the water as a volunteer and not as a board member was in 2013. So yeah, goes back a while.
Goes back a bit. So, most of you know already, but for those who may be watching this on a recording, our organization was founded in 2009 as a nonprofit organization. We are an affiliate of the Waterkeeper Alliance that has 350 waterkeeper groups around the world. And we're comprised of 4 board members and 2 staff. And our mission is essentially to protect the water quality of Lake Pond Oreille and the associated water bodies. We're part of the Columbia River watershed. We contribute 10% of its entire flow. So we're quite a contributor to that. Our jurisdiction goes all the way from the Cabinet Gorge Dam to Albany Falls Dam. And these are just some of the things that we do. Carolyn really hit it hard this past summer and fall with some cleanups that we did. We picked up over 1,500 pounds of trash. Since I've located another 17 tires in the lake just over by City Beach, and we're going to be working on getting those out this next week, hopefully before the snow flies. We've had our water quality monitoring program has been, this is our 10-year anniversary. We've done 13 sites, sometimes 14 and 15 in those 10 years. It's all been run with citizen science and volunteers who have collected the samples for us. And we also are ramping up our stormwater monitoring program. We try to do the best we can to keep our community engaged with little events like this so that people can get a better understanding of the type of work that we're doing. And Carolyn's had a great little ed program that she created this last summer called Waterkeeper Wednesdays. And we also made a 6-part lake ecology video series in a workbook this year. So we're pretty proud of that. That'll be launched pretty soon and available on our website for teachers who want to use that program to educate their kids. It's geared towards sort of 5th to 7th graders. Some of the things that we're currently working on, as I had mentioned, stormwater. We've got 5 sites now that we're going to be monitoring through the course of the winter and spring. Wastewater has been a big topic of ours over the last year. Really, we've got Kootenai Pond Oreille Sewer District that's its system is completely stressed, and the city of Sandpoint is currently looking at a major upgrade to their system. Invasive species has been they've been a nuisance since we started this back in 2009, and we seem to keep having to work on that piece of it, mainly around sort of the herbicide treatment to that. And then most recently this year, we've been hit with an abundance of shoreline development, and there's been some moves to decrease or ease the rules on a county level within the vegetative buffer. So we've been actively engaged with the county over that. And then this year we saw a tremendous increase in the quantity of harmful algae blooms throughout the state, really, and that's part of why DEQ has had such a hard time keeping up with that. And they, unfortunately, when we get an increase in these algae blooms, the people who are in the surface water department get pulled away from their normal duties if they're writing a TMDO or something like that. Then they have to go out in the field and they have to test, and then they have to send it to the lab, and then they have to keep testing so that they know when it's safe for people to swim. So right now, I'm going to turn this over to Carolyn and then subsequently Gray, but I'm going to be signing off here. And so I wanted to just take, if anybody has any questions for me on any topics unrelated to the water quality monitoring program, I'm happy to try and answer those for you now. So does anybody have anything that they want to ask me unrelated to the monitoring program? Okay. I can't tell if somebody's trying to ask me a question. Are we good? Okay. Well, given that, Carolyn, I think I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you at this point. And thank you so much for all. I want to, thank Carolyn for the amount of effort that she's put into our monitoring program. She's really turned it around this year in terms of making sure that we're current and up to date. We're, all of our data is already included from this year in the presentation that you're going to see, and that's been a real feat for us. So thank you so much, Carolyn, for doing all you do on that, and Gray, you as well. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Carolyn.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve, for that. And welcome to everyone who joined during Steve's introduction bit. If you missed it, we're going to be recording this and sharing it on YouTube. So if you don't want your face on YouTube, we advise you to turn your camera off. And then if you wouldn't mind turning your mics off when you're not talking, just so we don't get the odd background noise. Hey, Steve, are you still there?
Yep.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna go into our water quality monitoring program. This was my first year managing the program, and it was such a great experience. I'm really fortunate. And I just want to say, first off, we have a lot of volunteers who are coming to this event, and you guys are amazing, and you are the reason this program happens. So we're all so grateful for all the work that you put into this program and all the time that you donate and volunteer. So the program was started in 2012. And what we do is we establish basically a baseline set of data so that we can establish what is normal for Lake Pend Oreille. And so as Steve mentioned, we sample 13 sites currently around Lake Pend Oreille and the Pend Oreille River. We sample a variety of sites that I'll go over in a bit. And we collect data on 11 different parameters that monitor biological, physical, and chemical parameters. So we just kind of get a variety of information, and volunteers also make notes that we can use to determine other aspects of the lake. And so Gray is going to go over more about what the data means. So we're going to do a review of what happened this year, as well as what happened in the past 10 years. So we've been doing this for 10 years, and we're the only entity doing this much monitoring and for this long. And so it's really amazing how much data we have. And then after that, we're going to go into who uses the data, where do we send it, what is it for, and then we're going to go into why is the program important, and then the future of the program, what we're envisioning for the future of our program, and then how you can help or get involved. So the program was started in 2012, and we currently monitor 13 sites. We collect physical, biological, and chemical data. And volunteers go out May through September once a month. So we monitor every third Tuesday of the month. And then we send in those samples. We send in some of those samples to a lab, and some I test in-house, and some are physical parameters that are written on a data sheet. And this is a citizen science program, which means these are volunteers who donate their time to conduct scientific research. And so I think citizen science is really important. There are a bunch of really amazing programs throughout the world. And so I think we're really fortunate to have such a long-lasting, a 10-year and robust program. And so we have state-sanctioned quality assurance project plan. Here's a typo. And so it's our QAP and so we wrote a QAP that tells every detail of the program. It's available online at our website if you want to go through this massive document. I've been editing it this year, and it contains everything you would ever want to know about why we started the program. There has a volunteer guide in it, so a step-by-step instructions for volunteers. So if they go out, they know exactly what to do. And since our data is collected by volunteers, we are labeled as tier 2 data. And without our QAP, we're only labeled as tier 3 data. So with our QAP that was state sanctioned, it means our data is more reliable and it's more robust. The only way we could step up to tier 1 is if we had paid employees collecting the data. So unfortunately, as a nonprofit, it's kind of hard to generate enough funding to pay people to go to 13 sites 5 times a year. But we still have amazing high quality data. It's basically tier 1, I think. But anyway, so the QAP is really important, and it has all this information, and it really helps us have a good quality, robust, reliable program. So currently we sample 13 sites. We have a variety of different habitats and areas. So we have a few bays such as Bayview, Garfield Bay, Bottle Bay, and Ellisport Bay. And these are kind of our deep water sites. And then Clark Fork Delta and over the Pack River Station monitor what's coming in from some of our major tributaries. We have a few sloughs. So we have Boyer Slough, Morton Slough, and Cocolala Slough. And then we have a site at City Beach, which is the popular swimming beach. And it's also where Sand Creek, it's close to where Sand Creek comes into the lake. We have a site near the Sandpoint wastewater outfall. And then we have a couple in the river. So we have one in between Dover and Sprigny Point, which is the same site that DEQ monitors, so we can compare how our data compares to theirs. And then we have another site down at Laclede. And so all the blue sites are active and the gray sites are discontinued, but that data is still available online. Are there any questions this far? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So as I said before, we collect biological, physical, and chemical data. For biological, it's focused on E. coli and total coliform bacteria. E. coli is technically a type of coliform bacteria, but coliform bacteria is bacteria that comes from human or animal waste, or comes from the soil, or is bacteria that interacts on the surface. E. coli is bacteria that comes from fecal material. So E. coli is a bacteria that shuts down beaches, but total coliform bacteria can be high, but it can just be near like a field or have a lot of erosion coming in from it. Then for physical, these ones are measured in the field. So transparency and turbidity are measured using a Secchi disc, which is the bottom right corner. And so it's a weighted black and white disc, and it measures the how far the sunlight goes down into the water column. And so as you can see on the left, the person is lowering their Secchi disc down, and they lower it until they can't see it anymore. And so it'll disappear, and that's when it hits the turbidity, and that's the maximum depth of sunlight penetration. And so that's the same depth that we collect samples at with our vertical water samplers, which are pictured in the top right. These are handmade by Will Young, a local limnologist or lake scientist over in Hope. So the volunteers measure the Secchi disc depth, and which is different for every site. Gray's going to go more into that. And then then we lower the vertical water samplers down to that depth, and the samples that we collect come from that depth. And then for chemical, we measure dissolved oxygen and pH in-house. So we recently invested in a couple of high-tech instruments from YSI Environmental and Hanna Instruments, and those are in the top left picture. Those are what I do. The volunteers fill that amber bottle with a sample from their vertical water sampler, and then I test them for pH and dissolved oxygen. We used to do these on site, but the results weren't as accurate as they now are with our monitors. So we're upgrading our data, we're collecting better data, but it just takes funding in order to afford instruments like this. And then next we test for total congenital nitrogen and nitrate nitrite, which are types of nitrogen. We test for total phosphorus, orthophosphate, and total organic carbon. And so those last 5, including as well as the E. coli and total coliform bacteria, are all sent into a lab down in Kellogg. Everything else is written down on the data sheet that volunteers collect. And so this is a wide variety of parameters that gives us really good insight into what's happening in the lake. There's a million different things you can test for in limnology or freshwater science. However, this is a really good broad base set of data that still allows us really good insight into the health and the quality of the water. Any questions about these?
Carolyn, I do have one question.
Mhm.
I think it's the 5 months you sample is it May to September,
Yes.
correct? Why
Um,
not other times of the year?
It's based on the height of the water, and also the weather. So I think we used to sample June through October, but in 2019 we moved it May through September because October could be really questionable, and the lake starts lowering in September. And so some sites like sloughs, like Boyer Slough, is really low in October, and
Oh,
so
yeah.
the water quality that you assess in that time is much different.
Okay.
I might add to that, another consideration in changing from what we used to do was June through October, and indeed October was very difficult sampling time because they were lowering the lake at the time, especially the river sites had significant flow in them. But we moved it, we added the May site in the hopes that we do a little better job of catching some of the spring runoff into the lake rather than waiting till June. So that was one of the rationale for moving it from June through October to May through September.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So now we're gonna go into what the data means. So I'm gonna pass it on to Greg to go more in depth about this.
Okay.
Oops.
All right, what you should have up there is a part of our website now. Can everybody, is there anybody who can't see a website? What I'm going to do is use the graphs that we had, that we've graphed the data and put it on the website, and I'm going to use that to go through a discussion of what we've found over the 10-year period for the various parameters. And so part of this, for those of you who haven't looked at this on our website, part of this will be instructional as well as to how you access those data. And so the first thing that you can do is when you go to what we do, you'll see that under our programs, we got water quality monitoring program, and then we've got what tests, the 11 tests that Carolyn has just talked about, and then an interactive map of the different, that show the different sites that Carolyn has already mentioned. And the interactive map, I'll show you later on, the interactive map, well, let me show you now. It's what Carolyn has just showed you. And if you click on any one of these sites, it'll take you to site-specific data for that particular site. I'm not going to use that too much. I'm going to do more of the overview. So let's see, let me go back to this site, and I can get to that by going to what we test for. So if I click on that, then you'll see this page comes up with the water quality parameters on it. And there are the 11 parameters that that Carolyn has talked about that we measure for or send off to the lab and have them do an analysis for it. Let me say also that I know we've got Denise online and Preston online. They have been volunteers for the program, either present or past, and I invite them at any point, or any of you at any point, to ask questions, make comments, help me in the interpretation of the data if I miss something, which is very possible as we go through it, but feel free to butt in at any time. It doesn't bother me in the least, and it makes for probably makes for a more interactive presentation. So I'm going to start out with transparency. That's the Secchi disk measurement that Carolyn talked about. And let me first of all just go through what the format that these data are presented in on the. This will be similar for each one of the graphs that I show. First of all, on the y-axis is going to be the measurement, whether it's a concentration of a nutrient, in this case the Secchi disk depth or the transparency depth, and then along the bottom are each one of the sites, and it includes the sites that are both active and those that aren't. And I think I need to minimize something here so I can see the whole thing. There you go. Okay. So, and then in addition to that, in this particular case, we can select looking at an individual year or all of them together. And I'll be using that to illustrate some things as we go along. The color codes relate to the month of the year in which each of the individual samples was taken. So you can see May is in green all the way through October in blue. In addition to that, if you actually scroll over a data point, it will show you when that data was collected, what the site is, and the value at that particular data point. And so that can be kind of handy from time to time. So, okay, so this is all of the data for transparency. And transparency is the depth that you can look as you're looking through the water column to see how far you can see down into the water. It's a measurement of the depth that you can see. And there are a couple of things that can affect that depth. One of them is the amount of sediment in the water, obviously, and another one is the amount of productivity in the water in the forms of periphyte and algae and that sort of thing. What it is it's a surrogate measurement for something called total suspended sediments or total suspended solids, really. And that's another measurement that could be taken. We don't take it, but it's where you pass water through a filter and pre-weigh the filter both before and after you pass the water through it. And that gives you a measurement of total suspended solids. So this is a surrogate for that. And if you look at these data, there are a couple of things that are gonna jump out at you. First of all, there are a number of the sites that are the Secchi disks at almost every sampling date are fairly shallow. And those are the sloughs. Here's Boyer Slough, Kokolala Slough, Morton Slough, and then there are some that are intermediate as well. City Beach tends to, this is Kokolala Slough. City Beach tends to be a little bit more transparent, but also fairly shallow Secchi disk, as opposed to some of the ones that the Bayview site, the deep water sites, the Clark Fork Delta, Garfield Bay, Ellisport. These are deeper sites. Even the Pend Oreille River site is a fairly deep site. So So those tend to have clearer water. You can see farther into them. They have less material that's blocking the light going down. Now, there's an interesting thing that in looking at this data, and this is kind of a neat thing that you can do with these. But if I click on any one date, I can get all of the data for that date through the sites. And I'm going to click through the various times and watch the deep water sites relative to the shallow water sites, the sloughs and that sort of thing. So watch things like Bayview and Clark Fork Delta and Garfield Bay as I go through the deals. You can see that those are the deep water sites. The transparency is increasing as we go through the season. And I've got somebody at the door. Hang on just a second. No.
Okay, so.
So at any rate, I've interpreted that to mean that early in the season, like in June, and then and even in May, where they're fairly high, where the Secchi discs at those deeper sites are shallower, there's probably, this is springtime, there's probably a lot more sediment in the water. And as you go through the season then at those deep water sites, that clears out, the sediment settles out, and you can see farther down into the water column. Whereas at the shallow water sites, there's very little change as you go through the season. As you can see, the Secchi disc stays pretty much the same. So that's a nice way that you can use these particular graphs to trace things through time, and also you can look at individual years as well. So that's transparency.
Hey, Gray.
Yeah.
Preston has a question asking if we've ever looked at transparency data relative to depth at that site.
Hang on just okay, go ahead. I've got confused, chaos reigns in my place right now. So go.
Have you ever looked at how transparency data is relative to the depth at that site?
Have I talked about that?
Or have you looked at the data for depth versus transparency?
Well, no, I haven't specifically correlated the depth of the site to transparency, but I think intuitively the shallower sites have lower or shallower Secchi disc readings, meaning that they're more productive in terms of, and they turn out to be more productive. We'll see that in a minute, in terms of total organic carbon and some of the other parameters. The other thing is that some of the, let me go back to something here.
And can I say something really quick, Gray?
Yeah, just a minute. So the other thing about that is that many of these intermediate sites, which are intermediate in depth, one of the things that you'll find as you do the sampling at some of these sites, like in June, and especially July and August, that some of these sites you'll encounter a weed bed. And that is obviously, as far as you can see, once that Secchi disc goes below the top of the weed bed, you can no longer see it. And so that ends up being recorded as a Secchi disc, which is really the top of top of the weed bed. And we take our samples then at that point. And Carolyn mentioned that these Secchi disc readings are where we do take the water quality samples, the samples for the water quality analysis. Okay, go ahead, Carolyn. What?
I've looked at sample depth, oh wow, transparency depth relative to the sample site depth, because it's written on the data sheets, but we don't do anything with sample site depth. I think besides look at it, we don't have a graph of that. Because some sites, like I think like Clark Fork River Delta is just really deep. It's like 70 feet deep, and only if you have a depth finder on your boat, you can find it. Whereas in places like sloughs, you can just use your Secchi disc depth to measure the site depth. But just not all sites we know exactly how deep they are. So that's just one thing to know. We can't always do that. And then what was my other thing I was going to note? But yeah, it does change really regularly. Some sites like City Beach consistently has really clear transparency. City Beach, almost always you can see the Secchi disc at the bottom of the lake bed. And then sites like sloughs, like Boyer Slough and Morton Slough and Coquilala Slough, they're really highly productive. There's a lot of organisms living within the water, and so that makes it a lot more muckier. They usually have softer bottoms, so there's more sediment present. Or if you compare it to like a deep water site, there's usually less sediment and other organisms living in that area.
That's a good point, and especially the point about the depth at a given site where the Secchi disc is on the bottom. One of the things that we use when we send out with the volunteers is a data sheet, and one of the things that is recorded is whether or not the Secchi disc hits the bottom, and you can still see it. And that is, like Carolyn mentioned, that's the situation at oftentimes at City Beach, and probably at some of the sloughs as well. I know when I was sampling Coquilala Slough, that was the case at some times. So that does enter into these measurements as well. Are there any other questions about this or comments? All right.
Thanks,
let me
Preston, for your question.
Pardon me?
Thanks, Preston, for your question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Preston. So let's look next at total organic carbon. And total organic carbon shows a little more. This is a measure of the productivity. This is a measure of the amount of carbon in the water sample. And the total organic carbon is a measure of the productivity of the site. And so again, it follows kind of the same pattern as the Secchi discs, with the higher concentrations of total carbon being in the sloughs and the shallow water areas. And one of the deviations that Carolyn mentioned about the Secchi disc at City Beach hitting bottom, you see it was shallower, but in terms of total organic carbon, it's actually fairly low, indicating that the productivity is not that great there. Again, the deep water sites and many of the other sites are all very low relative to the productivity at the 3 or 4 sluice sites that we've had over the years. So that's a reflection of the Secchi disc related to that very strongly. Going to move on now to temperature. And we've got on this graph, we've got temperatures. You can either look at it in Fahrenheit or Celsius by clicking on one or the other. Let's look at it in terms of Fahrenheit. And this again is all of the data. And this is the temperature that is taken at the Secchi disc depth. In other words, it varies from site to site. and from month to month, depending upon what the Secchi disk was at that particular time. There's color coding, and you can see pretty by the way that the colors have amalgamated on the graph, or that have separated on the graph, that there is a seasonal difference, and I'll show you that even more in a minute. We did start, and I don't have a graph of it. We did start taking surface water temperatures, and they are more indicative, I think, of what has happened this past year in terms of algal blooms and whatever, in that they tend to be higher in the shallow zones than in the shallow water zones. They tend to be higher than the Secchi disk temperatures. Okay, so again, if you click through these temperature patterns at the different sites, go through time, you'll see, again, you can see how the temperature changes, and these are color coded. July and August usually are the peak temperature times, and then as you go down into September, you start get cooling, in October even more so. So it's kind of a nice way to be able to use these graphs to look at changes seasonally look at changes through the season. Let me highlight, I can just highlight and go back to, I need to reset this, and I'm going to go back to the 2021 data, and you can see that during July, we hit some pretty high temperatures, and relative to other years, they weren't as dramatic as some of the surface water changes, but they were definitely higher at most sites than they were in other years. And this was at the Secchi disk, and some of these are fairly deep, like 5-6 meters or so. Surface water temperatures were even more dramatic in their differences in 2021. Okay, let's look at another parameter. I'm always interested, I'm a gardener, so I'm always interested in pH as a measure of the alkalinity or acidity of a water body. And Lake Pend Oreille is alkaline, which is really interesting because a lot of lakes are not alkaline, but Lake Pend Oreille is. And there are very few pH. pH is a measurement of acidity or alkalinity. For those of you who are not familiar with it, 7 is neutral. Anything above, it's a logarithmic scale, so 7 is neutral, 8 is 10 times more alkaline than 7, and 9 is 100 times more alkaline than 7. So most of our pHs range in the 7.5 is really the lowest that in most cases that we've seen. Most of them are in the 7.5 to 8.5 range, and there are a few outliers on the upper end that are interesting, and I have some ideas as to why they're up there in some of the sloughs, but I'll leave that speculation to another time. I want to point out something though, and Carolyn mentioned it with regard to our equipment. We changed the way we measured pH in 2020, and so before 2020, let's just look at 2018, you'll see that all of the data fall at either 7.5, 8, 8.5, 9. They're at a half unit measurement. The reason for that is that these data were taken colorimetrically. We took a sample added a drop of an indicator to a vial, and then compared that to a color chart that was to the closest half of a pH meter. So you can see how the pHs range in the 17, 18, 19 range. Now watch as I go to 2020. They jump up. In 2021, they're up higher. Okay, the method that we changed to was electrode-based pH meter that is standardized with buffers, and it is a more accurate measurement of pH. And so this is something that when you're collecting water quality data or soils data or whatever, it's important to know what you're using in the way of a technique, in the way of a methodology. And in this particular case, we see a change from when we converted to the new electronic method. There's not much to talk about in terms of the influences of an alkaline pH, unless you're trying to grow blueberries and using Lake Pond Oreille to irrigate with. Then we'd like to see soils growing blueberries down about 4.5 or 5, and for people who use lake water to irrigate with, it's going to be a challenge. I ran into that out at the Northside School when I was helping with the school gardens out there. Okay, enough about that. All right, let's move to some of the chemical parameters. So I'm going back, and I want to look next at orthophosphate. And this is a graph of all of the data for orthophosphate at all of the sites. It is a logarithmic scale. And the values are in parts per million or parts per billion or micrograms per liter. And you can see that the red line along here is the total maximum daily limit that the DEQ uses as a guideline for determining whether or not a water is impaired or not. And this is the data for Boyer Slough here, these values, some of which go up into the upper hundreds parts per billion of orthophosphate as expressed as the element phosphorus. This is the data that was used to alert DEQ that there was a problem and they needed to address it. And that is one of the uses that Carolyn will talk about later on. One of the uses that these data have is to, by continuously monitoring, I mean, if you're monitoring, you can see the number of data points that we have consistently, they're high. And so we can establish that that is something that DEQ should be looked at as an impaired water body. And there are some other sites that are show some higher levels of phosphorus. The Sandpoint wastewater outfall site from time to time shows values above the 9 limit. Some of the sloughs occasionally get up there, but most of the sites have orthophosphate levels that are fairly low and below that limit. Are there any? This was one of the key results, if you will, of our monitoring program over the years, that we were able to alert DEQ. I'm going to stop just a minute and see if there are any questions about that, because that's kind of a key point that we've made as a benefit of our water quality monitoring program, is the fact that we've got a bunch of data, reliable data, that we were able to use to alert DEQ that there was a problem in Boyer. Any
Hey,
comments?
this is Pat.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Are there other chemicals that are significantly above the limit that you'd like to see?
I'll show you some. This is the only one that really stands out as being, the other one that you might expect would be high would be nitrate. And there is a little bit of an indication that that is higher, but it's nowhere near out of bounds, as far out of bounds as the phosphorus is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we do orthophosphate, and keep these numbers in mind and these patterns in mind, because the next one that I'm going to show you is the let's see if there's anything else I wanted to point out about orthophosphate.
Hi, Ray. This is
Yeah.
Patty Dixon with Preston. We do the Morton Slough testing.
Yes.
And just a couple things. One about Morton Slough to start with. As we've done that for 3 years now, we're seeing more development on the lakeshore. People are, there's lots being sold and houses being built. So I think it'd be very interesting to see what happens with Morton Slough, which has pretty decent quality water, but it'll be interesting to see what happens there. The other question, and maybe this is an obvious answer, but why does Boyer Slough have such terrible water?
Because it receives runoff from the Kootenai sewage treatment plant.
Okay, even though I knew that answer, I just thought it might be okay for everybody to know that there is a direct cause.
Yeah, and you know, well, we don't measure the inflow directly. We're measuring at a static point within Boyer Slough. It's up to DEQ to really get in and do the monitoring necessary to determine just how much the plant is actually affecting the water quality. Like they should be monitoring the direct inputs to the slough coming down that tributary. So thank you for pointing that out, because that's or suggesting that, because that's actually, when you come to, we are talking in all of this about measuring at static points, the same point, time after time after time in open water lakes. And you'll see later on when we go to future programs that could be beneficial to this program, it's actually monitoring the stream water that from the tributaries that are coming into the various bays and sloughs and that sort of thing. And that gives you a much better idea of where the loading is coming from. And I agree with you that as Morton Slough and other areas, Boyer Slough even, as they develop more and more, this data set will provide a really good baseline to be able to track any changes if they do occur. So thanks for that comment, Patty. That's important.
Thank you very much, Gray.
Okay. So I want to go to total phosphorus then. And this is actually what DEQ sets their TMDLs on. But you'll see that with this one, you still see Boyer Slough being head and shoulders above all of the others. But you do see some higher concentrations of total phosphorus, not orthophosphorus. Orthophosphorus is the phosphorus that is in solution. It is dissolved, if you will, in the water. This total phosphorus measurement not only measures that phosphorus, but it also measures any phosphorus that is incorporated in tissue, in algae or periphyton or anything, weeds, anything that we happen to sample in our samples. So this is an indication that even though the orthophosphate levels at some of these other sites are low, there is still significant amount of phosphorus that has been incorporated into the actually the organic matter that is represented by the total organic carbon that I showed earlier. And this kind of mirrors that pattern that we saw with the total organic carbon as well. A concern, slight concern that it's in the organic form, because as that material dies and decays and goes to the bottom, it can liberate phosphorus as it decomposes, and that can fuel weed growth and other undesirable types of growth. Not all weed growth is undesirable. I don't want to imply that, but it is a potential source of release of phosphorus later on. Okay, I'm going to come back to orthophosphorus when I look at Boyer Slough in particular, because it's kind of, maybe I should do it right now. Let me go back.
Hey, Greg, could I say something really quick?
Yeah, you can.
Thank you.
You may as well.
May I? Thank you. I don't think we mentioned this yet, but in case you're unaware, if you're watching this on the recording, but Lake Pend Oreille's nearshore waters are actually listed as impaired in the state of Idaho for phosphorus levels. And so that's where we get the guideline on phosphorus is the 9 micrograms per liter, 9 micrograms per liter. And so a TMDL means that there's actually a plan in place by the state to try and improve the water quality of Lake Pend Oreille's phosphorus levels. And so another part of our program is it's holding them accountable for the amount of phosphorus that's still in the water, and saying, hey, like we need to be stricter about shoreline development. We need to be stricter about permits that are allowed, because phosphorus is still really high and the plan in place isn't working. So that's another way that we can use our data, and we'll go over that more. But just to keep in mind that Lake Pend Oreille is currently impaired, and it was implemented, I think, in '96, and they did a review in 2002, and it was still impaired. So just keep in mind.
And that impairment is actually based on the total phosphorus rather than the orthophosphorus, and that's the value that I just showed a while ago, that shows many of the nearshore sites are above that 9, and it's actually micrograms per liter rather than milligrams per liter. It's parts per billion. It's a very low value because phosphorus is so dynamic. Phosphorus is so reactive. Okay, so another way I want to go back to Boyer Slough a little bit about phosphorus, because there's something that showed up interestingly in the data. So another way of using this data and this site, our website, to look at the data is to look at it on a site-by-site basis. And you do that by going to this interactive map and then clicking on any site that you're interested in. So if Patty were interested in Morton Slough, she could go down here and click on the Morton Slough site. I'm going to click on the Boyer site, and it gives you then a URL that takes you to the data that are specific for Boyer Slough. So if I click on that, what comes up then is the station. It says that it's impaired for both nitrogen and phosphorus. Carolyn has been the one who sampled it primarily this year. And then it lists all of the data for Boyer Slough, all of those 11 different parameters. Okay, I want to show you something that's interesting with regard to the orthophosphorus. Here's total phosphorus, and here's orthophosphorus, again in micrograms per liter. Okay, here's the orthophosphorus displayed from May through August. This is interesting because the median values of orthophosphate decrease through the season. And I interpret that as meaning that as the algae, as the weeds, as the periphyton grows in that water column, it is utilizing that readily available phosphorus, depleting the actual water quality value, depleting the amount of soluble form and incorporating it into the total phosphorus. And we don't see quite that same pattern because this is so dominated by the if we just had organic phosphorus, I think we'd see a straight line, but this same figure for total phosphorus is dominated by the orthophosphate. So you see the same pattern. But I found that as I was going through the data, I found that to be an interesting observation that our data revealed. Okay, let's go back to some of the other parameters. This was the total phosphorus. The next one I want to look at is nitrate, nitrogen. Okay. For reference, this is nitrate, nitrogen, expressed again on a logarithmic curve. For reference point, drinking water standard for nitrate, nitrogen is 10 parts per million. That's the top of this graph. So none of these values for nitrate fall in the category of being harmful for drinking water. On the other hand, you do see again some higher values for some of the sloughs. Morton Slough has some values, but mostly throughout the lake. The bulk of the data is right at our detection limit, right at the lower level. This lake in general is not impaired for nitrate. It is almost, you can almost call it pristine, especially in the open water areas of this lake with regard to nitrate. I've seen a lot higher nitrate nitrogen values in lakes throughout the Midwest that are more impacted by things like agriculture, runoff from fields, and that sort of thing, where the concentration of nitrate are much closer to the drinking water standard. So that's nitrate nitrogen, and the other one that we measure is total nitrogen, total Kjeldahl nitrogen. Total Kjeldahl nitrogen is a measure of the amount of organic nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. It does not, unless you do a special treatment in the digestion of a sample for Kjeldahl, you don't get the nitrate. So this is just organic and ammonium, and we don't do individual analysis for ammonia. But again, this is the higher values that you see for total nitrogen are again related to the sloughs, related to the areas of greater productivity that we saw with the organic carbon. So let's see. Dissolved oxygen, save that to last of the chemical parameters. You know, I expected to see a lot lower dissolved oxygen levels at certain times of the year in certain of the sites. I haven't seen it. Most universally, the dissolved oxygen measurements are above 7, many times in the 8, 9, 10 or above range. The lake is really quite healthy with regard to the dissolved oxygen status. There are a few outliers. I happen to be have intimate knowledge of this one because that's my data. And it was a sample that was taken right on the bottom. And so I obviously got into a zone where decomposition was taking place and consuming oxygen. Interestingly enough, when we can, each spring, Carolyn didn't go over this, but each spring we conduct a training session for all of our citizen volunteers. I like Carolyn and Steve, I can't say enough about the people who have been involved in doing the sampling over the years. What they have braved in their kayaks and canoes. I mean, I do it from a boat and it's stable, but I can't imagine in some of the conditions that they've been out in a kayak or canoe in open water. They deserve our respect and appreciation. But at any rate, I expected to see some values for dissolved oxygen that were lower than that, and I just haven't seen it. And there are some outliers on the upper end of these that are related again to zones of greater productivity. I could speculate that those occurred because the plant growth was vigorous at that time of day, and that's on those sites, and it took up the carbon dioxide out of the water, which carbon dioxide, when it gets into water, creates carbonic acid, which tends to lower pH. And as you get plant growth, it releases oxygen. And so some of these sites may be supersaturated with oxygen at certain times, because normally what you would expect would be lower oxygen concentrations with increasing temperature. Water can hold more oxygen at colder temperatures in the dissolved form, but we just don't see much difference in dissolved oxygen from site to site, sample time to sample time. It's pretty well oxygenated. Okay, so that's the last of the chemical parameters. Do any of you have any questions, comments that you'd like to make, whatever, about any of these data, or you want to look at anything in a little more detail? Okay, hearing nothing. The last couple that we want to look at are some of the biological factors, biological parameters, and it shouldn't be too surprising when you look at these that, again, for the sloughs, this is a total coliform bacteria. You get some fairly high values at certain times of the year. I honestly don't quite know how to interpret coliform bacteria data. I don't know how to relate it to much in terms of nutrient loading. And like Carolyn said, it's supposed to be an indication of contamination either by animals or humans. And so any of you who want to comment on any of these, feel free to do so. I am not a good biologist, if you will, when it comes to interpreting coliform bacteria data, but here it is. Here's what we have.
Greg,
All right.
Greg,
Yes.
this is Preston.
Yeah, Preston.
When we're in Morton Slough, we see a lot of waterfowl,
Yeah.
ducks,
Yeah.
and, how much does that contribute
Yes.
to the coliform?
That certainly is a source, and I think that's a good observation, Preston. I wouldn't be a bit surprised that that's coming into play here on some of these areas. I don't know that it's for all of them, but if that's an observation that you've made, I'll buy that. I'll buy that as a theory, as a testable hypothesis. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay. And if you then go on to the E. coli, the other biological parameter, which is a more direct measure of what might be harmful to us, if we were to swim in the water, you'll see in this particular case, the guideline is 100 colonies and per 100 mils, and most of them are much lower, which would indicate that Preston, your theory has your observation has merit, that it's more likely due to wildlife of some sort. Denise, did you have something? I saw you pop up there for a minute.
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. How are you, by the way? Haven't seen you for a while.
I'm fine.
Good. All right. I think that is pretty much it in terms of what I wanted to point out. As I said, this site, when you go to the website and click on the what we do and go to the interactive map, that's where you bring up the site with the individual stations on it, and where if you're interested in any particular location, you can click on that location, and it brings up the URL that'll take you to the data for that particular site. That's it's really a neat feature of this website presentation of the data that Carolyn has put together. Okay, I'm going to stop my share. And back to you, Carolyn, or anybody else who wants to make a comment, question, whatever at this point.
Yeah. How's everyone holding up?
We have a lot of data points. We have collected a lot of data over 10 years. And I go back to people like Preston and Denise who've been involved in that. And can't thank you guys enough. It's a huge effort, a huge commitment. And I appreciate it. We appreciate it. And thanks. Yours, Carolyn.
Oh, did you have something to say, Preston? Or?
Yeah, I had a question about, I understand the guidelines or the levels of tolerance for the chemical and biological parameters, but I was curious about temperature. What does the guideline for temperature mean? Because I saw it was 78 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, the 78 was put in there at one time on the graphs. You know, I honestly don't know where that 78 came from. If I were setting a temperature limit, I would put it at 70, because that's typically the value that we refer to as being critical for a trout fishery relative to dissolved oxygen, because of the inverse relationship between temperature and dissolved oxygen. But at the same time, as I say that, I look at the dissolved oxygen concentrations in our water, and generally they're not a problem. And so I'm not sure. Travis put, when he was working for the Waterkeeper, came up with that 78 value. I would put it at 70.
Okay,
I don't
thanks.
know if that answers your question or not.
I guess we both have a question about it, so.
Yeah, it's if you go through EPA's list of how they set standards for various things, there are about 5 or 6 different categories that they can come up with limits for various chemicals or various parameters, and they're based on use. So wildlife is one use, drinking water is another use, industrial use is another criteria, and each one of those might have a separate a separate limit depending upon what that use is. So it's not, setting these limits is not as simple as just a single value for any of the parameters.
Yeah, I did some research earlier when I was setting up the graphs initially to determine if there's a limit. Because one thing, if you don't have much of a scientific background and you see a graph like this, you think, is that good? Is that bad? You know, you have no reference for if the lake is actually healthy, or if, you know, or if it's alkaline or not. And so we wanted to determine kind of a guideline so people who don't have as much of a scientific background could look at the graphs and say, okay, so Lake Pend Oreille is healthy, or oh wow, it is impaired for phosphorus. And so there are some things like phosphorus, which is set in a TMDL, a specific TMDL. And then there are some limits that are set by the state. There are some that are set by EPA. And some are, as Grace said, set for drinking water. I think when I was looking to set guidelines, I looked at drinking water, since 5 municipalities get their drinking water from Lake Pend Oreille. And then a few others get their drinking water from the Pend Oreille River. And so I thought it was a good standard to go off of. Plus it's the lowest. And so you might as well shoot for the lowest amount of nutrients to have a healthy oligotrophic lake. But yeah, that's something that I want to look into more. And so if you have any insight or advice on where to find limits for some nutrients that you might have questions on, I'd love to hear any input you have.
Data publicly.
And are there any other questions? I have a little bit of presentation left that I want to shoot through.
I just had one more question, this Preston again, about what is DEQ doing about the inshore phosphorus impairment that you noted, that's been noted?
I know that they have a monitoring site at Boyers Slough that they monitor, and I'm not totally in tune with their monitoring regime, but they do some monitoring. But as I think Steve mentioned at the beginning, they were so busy monitoring harmful algae blooms and they didn't have a big enough team. And so they kind of fell back on some of their TMDL work. But I think they are monitoring a few specific sites for phosphorus levels. And then they release a report probably once a year or so.
Thank you.
I can look more into that too and see if I can find out more for you, because I'd like to know too. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. And I realize it's getting late, so I try not to dawdle too much. So this is kind of a review of 2020. So we got that really unprecedented heat wave in late June and July, and that was reflected in our water temperatures that we monitored, both surface water and at depth. And then in August, with the smoke, it decreased solar radiation and it cooled off. We got some storms, so the water temperatures dropped. Ellisport Bay and Garfield Bay actually had lower phosphorus levels than they usually do historically, which I thought was interesting. Morton Slough had increased nutrient levels compared to previous years. Boyers Slough continued to have high phosphorus levels. And then just one thing to note was there was 3 harmful algae blooms around Lake Pend Oreille, which can be caused by high water temperatures and high nutrient levels. And one was in Boyers Slough, which has the high nutrient levels, and then in Sagal Slough and Chuck Slough. And those last 2 we don't monitor, so we're not totally sure what the nutrient levels were. So kind of a 10-year review. So one thing that's really interesting about our program is we have different habitat types, multiple of each that we monitor. So in the sloughs, we have those 3 sloughs, and then the wastewater outfall have much higher nutrient and bacteria levels given their habitat type, as well as the surrounding habitat and their use. So like you said, there's a lot of wildlife in Morton Slough and Boyers Slough as well. And I'm guessing Coquilala Slough, and then the wastewater outfall is kind of in that bay just past the Long Bridge. And so there's always a lot of wildlife in there. Deep water areas are generally very healthy. And in the TMDL that was done for nearshore to phosphorus, the south end of the lake was less impaired for phosphorus. And that might be due to because it's less developed. It is more mountainous areas. So there's less anthropogenic impacts from humans. It's also there's a lot more water. It's much deeper. And so there's a lot more water mixing. And then there's higher bacteria levels that I noted at City Beach. So when we looked at E. coli, and that's likely due to humans. And also when you go to City Beach, there's usually seagulls and geese everywhere. And so kind of like Morton Slough, there's different observations you can make that you can then tie into the data. And so that's one thing that we really appreciate about our volunteers is when they note things like, oh, there's really bad weeds. Oh, there's this certain species of macroinvertebrate that I noted, or I saw moose in the weeds. And so one thing that's really important about this kind of science is noting anything that you see that might relate to the data. Because we find it interesting, and if we see an outlier, we can go back and see if anything happened on that day that we can tie it to. And then as Gray mentioned, we have high dissolved oxygen levels across our lake, which is amazing. And then we have a higher pH than you typically see in a lake. And then so who uses the data? And so the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, is who we send our data to at the end of the season. And so we collect all the data from the lab and from the volunteers' data sheets. I fill out our QAP documents. We have a quality control officer go over all of our data in the QAP documents to make sure that we stuck to what we said we would do in our QAP and to make sure that the volunteers did everything in accordance with our collection standards. And then if we meet our QAP requirements, then DEQ is able to look at that data and use it and rely on it to make decisions based on, are we going to monitor more Boyer Slough? Are we going to start monitoring Morton Slough? So they're able to make informed decisions based on the data that we give them. And then as an organization, we refer to our monitoring when we write letters to the city of Sandpoint and Bonner County regarding development or other issues such as shoreline development. So I've included in the pictures a recent development at Boyer Slough, which as we know is impaired for phosphorus. This developer took out nearly all of the shoreline vegetation and exposed it to a bunch of erosion and to expose it to a lot more solar radiation. This is it was kind of the south end of the slough, and so they took out the southern end coverage, and so it was a lot more exposed to solar radiation and heat, this was a terrible year to do that. It was a hot year regardless. And then in the left picture, you can see the harmful algae bloom that took over Boyer Slough in early August and persisted until the slough drained in last month in November. And so we're able to say, hey, like you guys need to be stricter about what permits you allow, and we need to be really careful about shoreline development as well as keeping a vegetative buffer, because the shoreline vegetative buffer has been proven to reduce nutrient loading. And if our lake is impaired, we need to do all that we can to help make it healthier. And so we're able to use our data to talk to the public and show them what's happening, talk to local officials and say, you know, we are monitoring this and we need your help to help keep our lake clean. And then recently I had a gentleman from the Idaho Fish and Wildlife reach out and say that they were looking at temperatures regarding Pack River. And so I prepared an individual data sheet for him so he could look at it and see what patterns. And so I'm just going to advertise this to anyone who's interested in looking at the data. It is publicly available data, and I would love if anyone wants to take a look at it. We just ask that you send us a formal request via email, and we can work with you and determine how you might use the data. And if you do use it in a report or something, you just credit the Waterkeeper as well as our volunteers. So if anyone wants to look at the data, you're more than welcome to, and I'd love to work with anyone on interpreting the data. This program is monumentally important, I think. So what we do is we collect high quality data for a state agency, gives them insight into potential issues, and they can determine impaired waterways and TMDLs, as is what is done for Boyer Slough. It provides a baseline data to compare changing conditions. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but since we've been doing this for 10 years, we've now can see a pattern in a lot of the levels that we've detected in nutrients. We can see if they're falling or rising. And so if there's a lot of development around Morton Slough, we can see if there's more phosphorus being added from shoreline erosion and development. We can see if temperature is increasing because shoreline vegetation is going away. And other instances like climate change, like the heat wave that we had this summer, we can see how that might affect surface water temperatures or nutrient levels and just all the development that's happening around our shoreline. And so this is, oh, sorry, does someone have a question? Oh, okay. So anyway, this is as many scientists are aware that it's really great to have long-term consistent data in order to make informed decisions and to see patterns. And if there is an outstanding event, you're better able to make hypotheses about what might have happened and then keep an eye on it in future years. And then also it engages with the public. As we said before, we have fantastic, superb volunteers that are so incredibly dedicated to this program. I sampled a bit this year from a kayak and it's not easy. And so I'm so grateful for all the volunteers who have been doing this for so long. It makes a difference when you guys are really contributing to a worthwhile and valuable program. And it means the world. And it's really, I think it's, as someone who's always been involved with science, I realize how fortunate I am. And so I love working with people like people who don't have any background in science and they're nervous to get into it. But that's the great thing about citizen science is anyone can be a citizen scientist. We do a training session to teach you all that you know. We give you a volunteer guide. I'm there whenever you need help to kind of help you interpret the data or learn about what you're doing and what it means. And so it's a really great way to learn a new skill, to become more informed about the world around you and our lake that we rely on for so much. And then also we use it to inform the public. So we can tell them about what's happening in Boyers Slough, what's changing and what needs to be done to protect it. And so Gray kind of hinted at this, but one thing that's really fascinating to look at is the future of our program. So this has been going for 10 years. So, you know, what's the future of the water quality monitoring program? What are we looking for in the future? And so he hinted at remote monitoring. And so we did actually purchase a hobo monitor, which is from Onset Monitoring. And so we can put this little device that's like the size of a Tic Tac box. We can hook it. We can attach it to a secure station, such as on a pillar or a buoy, and we can leave it there and it will take data. It will collect data at a specific interval for as long as we want it there. And so it provides consistent data collection. And one flaw you might be able to see in our program is we only monitor once a month for 5 months out of the year. But with these devices, we can monitor multiple times a day throughout the whole year. And so that's a really great way to collect consistent data, and we can see if there is a single event that may have a huge impact on the water quality. And right now the one that we have is just for temperature, but there's so much really cool technology out there that we're looking into, and we're looking into expanding our program, expanding the timeline, and expanding what nutrients we might be able to monitor. You can see me in the top right corner. That was when I worked for the Forest Service, and we were putting in, we were changing out the remote monitors. And so I have experience doing it. I think it's a really great way to see how the data changes. It's a great way to get outside. And as you see, I'm doing it in a stream. And so as you see on the screen, also, we want to look into stream monitoring. And because Gray mentioned earlier that streams and watershed health is a huge indicator of the health of our lake. If we don't have a healthy watershed, we don't have a healthy lake. And so we really want to expand up into our watershed outside of the lake. And one way that we can do that is through the University of Idaho's Ida H2O Master Water Stewards Program. And Jim Eakins runs that, and he is an amazing, incredibly smart educator. His pictures are the bottom two ones. He works with kids, which is another way that we could get more involved with the community, is we can work with kids and do stream monitoring as part of the Ida H2O program. We can take them out. We can determine what microinvertebrates are present, which are a great indicator of water quality health. We can do temperature monitoring. We can do riparian zone monitoring, vegetation health. There's so much we can do with stream monitoring that I really would like to implement into our program, because I think it would be a great indicator of change as well. Increased sites. Right now, we're kind of limited by number of volunteers and funding. It's really expensive to send samples into the lab, and it takes a lot of time to go to a lot of sites. For instance, we only have one on the south end of the lake, and that's in Bayview, which is like an hour drive away from our office. And so we're really thankful for Dave Hamilton for transporting the samples every Tuesday of the month, or that on the sampling date, because it is a long drive to go out in the water and get the samples and bring them back and then go home. And so we are very thankful for that. but not many people are willing to do that drive on a weekday. And so that means a lot to us.
And
and
he's been doing it for a long time.
yeah. Yeah, he's still doing it, which is amazing. And then finally, stormwater monitoring. And so we're currently working on implementing a stormwater monitoring program within our QAP of our water quality monitoring program, so that we can get state sanctioned stormwater monitoring data because we are currently the only entity looking at stormwater that's draining into Lake Pend Oreille. And stormwater is currently one of the biggest threats to the health of Lake Pend Oreille. Stormwater, if you don't know, is the water that doesn't soak into the ground. So if it rains or rains on snow event, all the water that drains off is considered stormwater. And it usually can drain off of cars, off of lawns, off of soil that's been disturbed and can absorb water very well. And a lot of that brings with it nutrients and pollution, such as like diesel or 2,4-D or carcinogens that are sitting in the soil. And so we're really looking at amping up our stormwater monitoring program, because that's a huge threat, and monitoring that would be a really big step in the right direction. Any questions about these? Or any ideas for how to make it a really great program in the future? All right, well, if you have any ideas, email me. I'd love to hear them. And then, so finally, this is our last slide, how you can help. A lot of you here tonight, thank you for coming, are already volunteer citizen scientists. You guys do so much good in this world. So as Greg mentioned, we do 2 training sessions in April before the program starts in May. These are only an hour long. They're really fun. You get to listen to me and Gray talk about science. You get to stand in the sunshine at City Beach, and it's such a fun program. You get to meet other people who are interested. You get to go out on the water and collect scientific data. It's such a fun program, and we depend so heavily on our volunteers. We genuinely could not do it without our fantastic volunteers. And another way you can volunteer is being a backup volunteer. This year, we actually had some issues, and we lost a couple of volunteers after our first sampling date. And we had a couple of backup volunteers who actually weren't able to step in on the dates that we were sampling. And so there are a couple of times where either Gray or I sampled 3 different sites in one day. And it's a lot of sites to sample. It takes about an hour when you're on the water to collect all the samples. Then you have to transport. If you're Gray, you have to put your boat on your trailer and haul it out. Or if you're me, you have to lug your kayak up onto the top of the car. And so being a backup volunteer is extremely valuable. You just go to the training, and then if we have a scheduling issue, I'll contact you as soon as I can and see if you can volunteer. It's typically on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, but sometimes if there's a predicted thunderstorm or high winds that morning, we'll move it to the next day. So being a backup volunteer is also incredibly worthy, and we will celebrate you just as much as our normal volunteers. Another way you can volunteer is if you have a boat. As Gray mentioned, a lot of people volunteer from kayaks, and that's not easy in a lot of sites, such as on the river. And so if you want to volunteer your time and be a boat captain, you could generally benefit a lot of people who, especially in harsh weather, and really help it make the sampling safer for our volunteers. And plus you get to see what they're doing. You get to watch them take cool pictures that I can use for social media. Like this fantastic picture of Preston that Patty took that I use all over the place. And then finally, if you have experience with data and you want to work with our data, please reach out to us. We have so much data, and I would love to learn from someone who has a lot of experience analyzing data about how we can make really informative graphs, informative conclusions based off of our data. If you want to analyze our data and look through it and either, just do something for your own research or do something they think could benefit the public, please reach out to us. It'd be really interesting to see what people can come up with. And then if you have data entry experience, this summer I had a couple of volunteer girls from college who helped me prepare bottles and enter data into our master Excel sheet. And this was a really great way for college age students to get involved in a local nonprofit to learn. I would teach them about what I did with my job. It was a little bit of job shadowing as well. And I kind of got their foot in the door with the nonprofit realm. And so if you know anyone in college who wants to kind of get involved, you just have to be 18 to volunteer. So anyone who wants to volunteer can, that's 18 or has their parents' permission. Also, you can donate. We are a nonprofit, so we rely on community support and grants. And this is one of the biggest bills we have in our nonprofit. We write a lot of grants and ask for a lot of help from our community to fund this program. I think I mentioned it costs about $2,000 per sampling date just for the lab tests. And so that's over $10,000 just there, just for lab tests and all the other things that come up for equipment maintenance and paying for staff time to try and recruit volunteers and do data entry. And so it really makes a difference. It makes this program happen. And then advocate for this program, tell people that it's happening, encourage your friends to volunteer. If you have someone who owns a boat and wants to get more involved, tell them that they can join us, or just advocate for our organization. It does make a difference if you just, through word of mouth. And so that's it. So thank you so much for coming to our presentation. I know it's a little late. We do have a short survey. So when we end when you leave this presentation, there on your desktop browser, there will be a short survey just saying, did you like the presentation? Did you learn anything? What are you looking for in future? Keeping up with the Waterkeeper presentations. So we'd really appreciate if you filled it out or just send us an email or contact us on social media, however you want to get a hold of us, and let us know what you're interested in hearing about at future meetings. If you have any more questions regarding our program or our data. And again, I'm going to post this on YouTube after tomorrow morning. So if you want to watch it or share it with your friends, we'd really appreciate it.
And a thank you from me as well for all of you who showed up and your questions and insights. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thanks all. Appreciate it. It was a very good presentation.
Thank you, Pat, for
Thanks,
coming.
Pat.
Yep. You're welcome.
Thanks for your input, Preston and Patty.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very informative.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Thank you, Denise, for coming.
Yep.
Yep, good to see your name on the screen.
I guess if we don't have any more questions, does
You
the
got
person
anything?
does the person with an iPhone have? Oh, okay. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.
Okay.